So let's think about this. When ChatGPT was released not too long ago, what are people using it for? They're using it for plagiarizing. They're using it to make money. They're using it for blogging, and they're using it for tasks that we don't want to do, but and so we're letting artificial intelligence take over and do the work that we don't want to do. Is that the kind of world that we want to live in going forward? Because let's think about this. New technologies like ChatGPT, VR, AR, even social media as it became popular. Were we ready for those technologies? We really weren't, because when new technologies are released, they are automatically used for not necessarily their intended purpose, but for personal gain, for personal satisfaction. For example, you go onto VR platforms, maybe not for conferencing for the everyday user or for creating your own worlds, but you go on there, why? To socialize, just like you would in the real world. You might use artificial intelligence to increase your workflow, which is great and should be used for workflow more often, and especially in industries like the medical industry could really use AR, and engineering design could really use AR. But for the average user, at least in 2023, we aren't quite ready to integrate that into our lives because we don't know how to. And that's the other thing to think about, is we don't necessarily know what to do with the technology that we create when we create it. Why do we create? Well, humans have been innovating and creating new technologies to improve our everyday lives since dawn of civilization. You might not think of agriculture as technology, but that was an innovation. It was a technological innovation. Not necessarily what you would think of today, like a mobile phone or a new computer, but it was an innovation that was meant to improve our collective lives, the collective lives of the society or culture at hand. And that's not something they were necessarily prepared for, but when it came, they used it the only ways that they knew how, and the ways that they saw that they could benefit from them at the time. Let's think about history as well. We've got when radio was replaced by the TV set, that killed the radio star, right? And yet, new jobs were created in spite of that. And when mobile phones came into play, social media started emerging, and people they started using the phones for more productive means and veered less towards TV on a day-to-day basis. They still might watch TV. I still watch TV in the evenings, especially after a hard day's work, but I'm on my phone for most of the day. without the phone, well, what people used to do without mobile smartphones, they waited for somebody to call the landline, and if nobody called the landline, what would they do? They would play poker. They would interact with people. They would interact with the world. And so before the emergence of social media and mobile phones, people wanted to socialize. People wanted to interact. They wanted things to do. And so now you look at people in a room sometimes. It's very interesting. Gary Vee, if you know who that is, actually addressed this at one point in one of his podcasts, and it's the idea that before mobile phones, okay, two people are at dinner and they're looking at the floor. They're not talking. Humans weren't necessarily made to talk to each other and interact with each other all the time, right? So without the mobile phones, they're just staring at each other, looking at the floor, looking all around, silent. But now with the mobile phones, they're on their phones. Today we look at two people on a date at dinner, looking at their phones, like, God, they're not interacting. That's so sad. That's probably not going to work out. But thank goodness they have those phones, because they're not necessarily going to be talking every single second most of the time. Sure, I would hope that people have more drive and opportunities to socialize and interact with each other in the real world. But mobile phones gave people something to do. Our minds are constantly occupied. Our minds are constantly thinking. And that's one of the reasons we started this podcast is we've got about 70,000 thoughts every day. And we don't, how many of those do we actually entertain and think about deeply? Very little. Only the ones that matter to us in the moment. Like, oh, I wonder what I'm going to eat for dinner today or tomorrow. Oh, I wonder what next week is going to look like. Oh, I wonder if they're going to have this at the store. Our brains are constantly working. Why do you think we take our phones to the bathroom? We didn't used to do that, but thank goodness we have it now, because it gives us something to do. It gives our brains something to look at and to play with and to think about, even if it's mindless thinking in a way. If you're playing games or just scrolling through social media, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And so we're using these technologies because we're not necessarily ready for all of the potential that it has, for better or for worse, but we are ready to use it for how we see fit. And on a personal level, it it's not necessarily a bad thing if it's used in the right ways.